on today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Our guest today is former Trump administration official and communications executive Julie Roberts. You may not know Julie, but you likely remember Sharpie Gate. Julie Roberts found herself embedded in that senseless controversy that involved a president, a hurricane, a map, and a marker. She also faced public threats and an internal investigation because of it.
And I get a phone call from somebody at the Hurricane Center and they say, "Oh my gosh, have you seen it? What is going on?" And I'm like, no clue what they're talking about. Come to find out that the president had taken a national weather map, a NOAA map, from the Friday before, and unbeknownst to any of us at NOAA, had taken a Sharpie and altered the map, an official map, which has got all kinds of problems.
Let's join today's episode with communications executive Julie Roberts.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest is communications executive Julie Roberts. Hello, Julie, and thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you.
Thank you. So Julie and I met recently at the Principal's First Dinner in Dallas, where Colin Allred was the guest speaker. She told me a couple of fascinating stories, and I decided that at that moment that my listeners needed to hear those stories too. So let's start with this one. You served as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Communications for NOAA, and that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. That was during the Trump administration.
Yep, that is correct.
Did anything noteworthy happen while you were there that you had to defend in your official capacity?
Well, I mean, I could tell you all kinds of fun stories from my 3.5 years inside of NOAA in a Trump administration. But let's talk about a little thing that might have involved a Sharpie and maybe a president who wouldn't admit that he was wrong when he misspoke saying that Hurricane Dorian in 2019 would be coming across the state of Florida and making it landfall into Alabama. Now, full disclosure, at one point, Hurricane Dorian, when it was very far off the coast, was potentially going to come across the state of Florida and potentially into the Gulf of Mexico. But unfortunately, when the president said that, he had been provided information that showed that, in fact, it was not going to do that, that the path had moved and had changed. And just a little bit of kind of background on what, for those who don't remember Hurricane Dorian. So massive hurricane that came across the Atlantic, ended up coming over the Bahamas and sitting in the Bahamas for a number of hours, and like 2 to 3 days number of hours, right? So catastrophic damage in the islands. We were watching it at NOAA. So a little of my background, I have a background in disaster management. And so my goal was, how do I take the NOAA team at the Hurricane Center and really embed them into FEMA, into that operation? So my boss and I showed up the weekend before, so it was Labor Day weekend, over at the National Response Center for FEMA, and began work in Hurricane Dorian. I told someone the other day, in a 10-day period, I worked about 150 hours. So now let that sink in, right? Because that's kind of context into this. And so we were there that Sunday. So it's Labor Day weekend. That Sunday, the president comes in. That's when he mentions Alabama. At this point, the Alabama Weather Service Office for National Weather Service has no idea what's going on and just says, "Oh, that's not correct." This is all kind of important stories that lead into what actually happened later in the week. So that was Sunday. We're kind of trying to educate the White House. Hey, this is what's really going on. This is where it is going now. And Wednesday, we're in the thick of this massive hurricane sitting over the Bahamas. And I get a phone call from somebody at the Hurricane Center and they say, "Oh my gosh, have you seen it? What is going on?" And I'm like, no clue what they're talking about. Come to find out that the president had taken a national weather map, a NOAA map, from the Friday before, And unbeknownst to any of us at NOAA, had taken a Sharpie and altered the map, an official map, which has got all kinds of problems when you do that, and turned it around in the Oval Office. And none of us were aware. And that was Wednesday. So at that point, now it becomes known as Sharpie Gate, and we're trying to figure out how to message that. I'm providing talking points to the White House, and they're just not rolling it back. So that is all Wednesday. Thursday night. At this point, I'm working 12, 15-hour days. I go to bed. It's midnight. We knew that the president and the secretary of commerce were trying to figure out what to say and do. I got woken up at 3 a.m. By the secretary of commerce's senior leadership team. They were in Greece, or abroad. And so they wanted me to, one, they couldn't find my boss because he had a cold and taken some medicine and turned his phone off, but my phone was on. So they woke me up at 3 a.m. and said, put a history together of what has happened this week for the White House. So at 3 a.m, I did it. Kind of crazy enough, the next morning I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, I wrote a pretty good statement. I mean, not statement. Let me clarify that. I did not write a statement. I should have said wrote a really good summary at 3 a.m. I was really surprised. And I also kind of talk about like I take Ambien to sleep. So I was even more surprised. It made sense, right? So I got up that morning. There's text all over the place on my work phone. I called my boss and said, hey, I'll kind of pick you up. We're going to go back into the Commerce building. We were there. We met with leadership and a statement gets drawn up. We tried to clarify the statement that was coming. It was not written by me nor my boss at the time. But we were there trying to figure out how to message to explain why we shouldn't put this statement out. Fast forward. So this is all first thing in the morning, 8 a.m. By lunchtime, we have lunch. And then I'm basically told, here's you a statement. Neither of us supported it. And I was basically told we had to put it out. And so I have had people who have said, well, you should have resigned at that moment. I didn't resign for a couple reasons. One, if I resigned, the career staff that worked for me would have been forced to push it out. Two, I potentially knew the blowback, and I didn't want to put my staff in that position. And so I didn't resign. I had no idea what we unleashed. So that was a Friday night. And I started getting thousands and thousands of hate emails. I've had things said to me in emails by people that don't know me, don't know anything about me, that were horrific. And so that was bad enough. That Saturday morning, I woke up and the story was on the front page of every major newspaper. And my boss and it was assumed I drafted the statement. I had to tell people, no, I did not. I didn't talk to anyone. I had press calling my personal phone looking for me. I did not speak to anyone in the media until all the investigations were done. So that was a 5-7 day period of time. I had worked ungodly amount of hours and was, woken up in the middle of the night, asked to do this, show up, handed a statement, forced to put it out, and then had to deal with the repercussions for the next 9 months. Wow.
So for those of you who don't remember, Sharpie Gate is when the president expanded, you touched on it earlier, but really concisely, it's expanded the boundaries of Alabama to show that the hurricane would likely hit Alabama, even though that's not where Alabama was located.
Well, it wasn't so much that. It was more that he drew the path of the hurricane to look like it would go into Alabama. So he didn't alter Alabama. He just altered Dorian to show the path that he was saying he thought it was going to hit. Yeah. Still bad enough. I mean, you can look it up. There's actually a Wikipedia page called Sharpie Gate. If you Google Sharpie Gate, there's lots of articles. I always tell people, my name is very close to the name of an actress, so that benefits me. A lot of times can't find me unless you kind of are looking for something specific. But it really unleashed a crisis that I wasn't planning for. We've talked about it. I served in the Bush administration for 4 years, much lower positions, right? Like I was an entry-level person at that point. But I remember telling people I would have never been put into a position like this put me into, even at a senior level position, not by the president. I'm not saying that we might not have created our own problems during those days, but I never would have expected that President Bush would have put a staff person in that role, in that position. And so, it was a really hard time. Like my family's here in Texas and they were very worried about me. My mom was very concerned. I was very worried about my boss. He has small kids at that point. He was not in the political world at all. I've kind of been in and out, so I kind of know what that entails. But it was, thousands of emails, calls from security asking where I was to potentially have to put security around both me and my boss at the time. And I didn't talk about it. I exchanged some text messages with my family, and later I ended up in an inspector general investigation for months that, entailed me sitting through interviews. And the only thing they ever asked me about was a text message that was to my dad, where it was an article about the Secretary of Commerce's role. And I said, well, now maybe my staff will know it wasn't me. And that was the text they asked me about, because I didn't use my phone for texting. I got written up for deleting text messages on my work phone, but which is somewhat ironic now with all the signal gate happening, right? Like, I deleted text messages at 7 a.m. before any of this happened, because it was this whole chain of people that were not on their normal phones. I didn't know who it was. And I was like, I can't even track this at this point. So I just deleted it. But that was the only thing that, I was ever found for violating some rule or policy.
So could this Sharpie expansionism, could that have been a pretext for the idea of wanting to annex Canada and colonize Greenland?
Well, it's hilarious. There are some actual like Sharpie cartoons out there that show where they've adjusted Greenland, and and it's so interesting, I guess, funny. I don't know. There is a Sharpie Gate bobblehead, which I possess. I bought one. It's the president at the desk holding up the map, a replicated map. And every so often the story populates because somebody will be tied in. I will say a lot going on now because the dismantling of NOAA that's happening under the new Trump term. A lot of us did not choose to go back in for a second term. I made that decision in late 2020, really early 21, after January 6th. And so, it will be interesting to see, and it's heartbreaking to me to see kind of where we've gone from my time there to where we are now with the agency.
So you mentioned you worked in the Bush administration, George W. Bush, under FEMA Director Joe Albaugh and Labor Secretary Elaine Chao. How do you think Bush would have handled something like this differently than Trump did?
Oh, he definitely. I never would have worried when I was at the FEMA, so I was there in early 2001, right before 9/11. I left about 3 weeks before 9/11 and moved to labor, which is where I worked for Secretary Chao. There is no way that President Bush would have ever done any of that, right? Like, he would have never altered a map. And Katrina, obviously people were frustrated with him about how he handled Katrina, but there was a lot of situation that went into that. That was not just the federal government, right? Like, before Katrina, the state had to ask for assistance. The governor didn't want to do that, and that led to kind of how Katrina unfolded. I always remind people that FEMA had been responding in 2004 and 2005 to 6 hurricanes just in the state of Florida and had done a very good job. So, that was a whole interesting situation. I have known since I was 10 that I wanted to work for a president one day. And I grew up in Texas. And so when President Bush finally became president after recount, I really set a goal. And that's what I always tell young women that I advise. I'm like, I grew up in a small town in East Texas, single mom. You can do anything you want. Put your head down, do your job. Don't let anyone tell you not to do it. And I had the chance to do it twice. I mean, I went back and served a second administration under President Trump, which people questioned, why would I serve? And it was because I knew he needed people with experience. And I felt like it was my call to service. I haven't served in the military, so my call to service and to helping the country was by serving in an administration like I did.
Yeah, you made reference to the recount of 2000. It's funny how there were so many different aspects of the outcome of that. You went to Washington with Bush when he became president. I worked at the time for Texas Lieutenant Governor Rick Perry. So that when Bush became president, Perry became governor. So I was suddenly working for the governor. So that's another aspect of the exact same situation. So that's really interesting too.
Yeah, it's very intertwined, right? Like things that, happened because if a governor becomes president or, then the lieutenant governor steps up and it goes from there. I would not trade my first 4 years for anything. Like my time with the Bush administration was probably the best 4 years career wise. I've had very, very good jobs. I have had jobs. I loved my job at NOAA, other than Sharpie Gate. I loved my team. I loved the work I got to do. I told people, I was like, I basically dealt with issues from the floor of the ocean to the surface of the sun and everything in between. I worked with an amazing team. And I think so when Sharpie Gate happened, people were like, oh, you should have resigned in protest and not put the statement out. Like I said earlier, I knew my team would still have to do that. And I chose not to resign after because I knew our agency was going to be going through a lot and I wanted to lead through that. I will say, because all the emails came out after, that I had staff who immediately thought I did it, right? They were like, oh, she drafted it. It was all her. Until they started to see the conversations and I did a call with my staff and they could hear the emotion in my voice. I still get emotional when I talk about it. It was a really stressful leadership moment for me. And so, but they heard me talking about the stress and the position we were put into and that I did not resign because of them. And I actually gave them a lot more, they, respected me a lot more and understood why I didn't just walk out the door.
Okay. Good context there. So you worked for NOAA under Florida Governor Rick Scott.
So I worked for Florida Emergency Management under Rick Scott. So,
okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So you worked for Bush, Scott, and Trump. So all Republicans. So now you're back in your home state of Texas, the biggest Republican prize in the Electoral College. But you're attending dinners with guest speakers like former Democratic Senator candidate Colin Allred for an anti-Trump organization like Principles First. Are you one of them rhinos I keep hearing about?
I guess no. Actually, no, I am not a rhino by any means. I am not a Republican in name only because you know what? I am still the Republican that I was 25 years ago, or actually 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan was president. And that was the reason I wanted to go to Washington, right? No, I would actually say that those that they want to call a rhino are probably we are actually the ones that, still are very fiscally conservative. I'm not as socially conservative as some of my friends, but, I also believe I can be friends with people of all colors and races and, I try not to see color and that type thing. Right. And so, no, I'm definitely not a rhino, but I actually came out in the fall and endorsed Vice President Harris. I signed on to the letter that was put together of former Republicans under Reagan, the Bushes, Romney, McCain. And I wrote a statement of why I endorsed Vice President Harris. And, I had a lot of friends who were like, oh, you've gone to the dark side. No, I have not gone to the dark side. I have lived through chaos under President Trump. I know the players that are there now. I know the players that are not there. Vice President Pence and Pompeo and myself and all these other like-minded, sensible people are not there, which is why we see the chaos happening right now between tariffs and dismantling of our agencies and government. And so, I would say I found Principles First in the fall, ironically, because Heath, the founder, and I grew up in very small towns not far from each other here in Texas. And so I started following him and I said, this is a group that is not left or right. It's truly putting principle first. And so, I reached out and said, hey, I want to come to the dinner in Dallas. What can I do? How can I help? I liked hearing Colin Allred. I wish he was our senator now, right? Like I have a lot of respect for him. I said that to him at the dinner. My family is all diehard Republicans and everyone voted for Allred and Harris. And so that should say a lot to people that as a Republican family and somebody who is a conservative, I believed in putting party or country over party in the fall. And I will continue to help push the messaging for the right types of candidates. I just said it this week. I really wish Congress would go do their jobs and not worry about being in a Republicans, I should say, and not being primaried in 2 years. Because you may not have a country to worry about in 2 years, but more importantly, do your job and you shouldn't have a problem getting reelected. If you can't do your job and you're a Republican, I won't support you in the fall in 2 years. So you're going to have to decide.
I agree with all of that. Just full disclosure, I echo some of the things that you said. I mentioned that I worked for Rick Perry. I was a speechwriter for his staff. My first time being eligible to vote was I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, my freshman year of college. I worked for other Republican elected officials in Texas. People have called me recently a lib, a rhino, all those other things, which to me is even more personal because I took enough grief being a black Republican all those years, standing on principle, and now I'm being called other things. It's just really frustrating. And I support Principles First. I've been involved with the organization since the first summit in 2020. I attended that one in 2020, and then I attended the one in DC this year, and have done an episode with Heath Mayo. And so I'm very involved in politics. I'm just not partisan anymore. My principles haven't changed, and I support candidates who come the closest to supporting those same types of things. They don't have to be 100%. And so right now, I'm doing what I can to help the country survive. That's the biggest issue for me.
And that's what I believe, right? Like, it's not, I could have kept, people are like, why are you coming out and endorsing Harris, vocally, right? Like putting social media out, signing letters. And I was like, because I can sit back and not open my mouth, not say anything, and watch what I know is going to happen. I knew Project 2025 was a real thing, right? I know these people. So we haven't talked about it, but I was on the 2016 campaign. I'd lost my job and kind of completely unexpected. And because when you're in political jobs, that happens. And so I ended up on the campaign. I was immediately assigned to Vice President Pence, to then Governor Pence's team. So I got to know his team very well. But I just, I felt like, 2020 happens and all the contesting of that. And I thought, well, I won't do another term, even if he gets somehow reelected. January 6th happened. I could see the lights to the Capitol from my apartment in Virginia. I could just see all the police and stuff over there, and I was watching it. And then fast forward a couple of days, I saw the video of the Pence family being escorted out, and realizing that not only had I gotten to know, Mrs. Pence and his daughter and the governor, but I had gotten to know all the senior staff and the Secret Service and even his brother. And I'm watching them being escorted out and him being called a traitor. And I knew then and there, like, if somehow Trump runs again, he can't get reelected. And lo and behold, here we are. But I felt like I needed to speak out. And, I'm starting to speak out more on social media now and pointing out things. So we kind of maybe talked about this at the dinner. Like, I love when he says, let's change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Okay, well, has anybody ever asked the question, like, what would that actually cost? Because I did some research using AI, because as I told someone, hey, if AI is good enough to slash our government, it's good enough for this, right? And it would be anywhere from a $2 to $4 billion expense if we really and truly tried to change it. One, he can't. That's an international body that names that. But two, he throws these ideas out, but no one questions him. Like, what does it cost? He spent, $35 million so far playing golf every weekend, except for one over the last 9 weekends. And so it's just this, like, no one is holding him accountable to what is happening. And we were talking about this with Principles First too. Like, no one is holding him accountable to what Musk and Doge are doing to our government, right? And so you probably hear this too when someone says, when I'm like, I cannot believe what they're dismantling FEMA and dismantling NOAA. Those are the two agencies I've worked most recently with. Be like, oh, you want bloated government. No, that is not what I am saying, right? There is a way to do this. You can pull the Band-Aid off. But when you fire the people that work on the hurricane hunters, which then feeds the data for hurricane season, and they can't fly those missions, that's a problem. when you come in and you dismantle FEMA and you have now 30 plus tornadoes in the last 24 hours and catastrophic flooding, who's going to go in and support those communities? Because those localities don't have the funding for that. I don't care how much money you throw at them. There's not the personnel to manage these. And so that's where I get frustrated. And people do now, oh, you're a liberal. No. Somebody said last night, I was watching one of the shows and they're like, the world's like upside down. Like the parties have flipped here. So, and then the tariffs. So in the Bush administration, I worked at international trade at the Commerce Department. And so that was when we did free trade and we were working on trade ministerials left and right. And, we tried to keep manufacturing here, but it was already gone in the early 2000s. So it is the chaos I think we all knew was going to happen. And it's just really hard not to say, we told you so at this point.
Yes, I'll just leave it at that. Yes. Now, you're a native of Marshall, Texas, and a graduate of East Texas Baptist University. Which came first for you? Your interest in weather, politics, or crisis communications?
Politics. Since I was 10. So my dad has been in Florida pretty much my entire life. But he has been in and around politics my entire life as well. So I've had the opportunities to attend like a couple of the inaugurations and Republican conventions. But yeah, I knew it like 10 years old. That's what I wanted to do. But I also knew I wanted to do communications. So I started my college career at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches, Texas. Did that for 3 years as a communication poli-sci major. When I transferred home to East Texas Baptist, I had the same major. So I'm one of those rare kids that knows what they want to do and is actually able to accomplish that. My family, my mom, definitely, she always told us, she gave us the roots and the wings and told us to go fly and to follow our dreams. And so I've been able to do it, luckily.
That's interesting because when I was 12, I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I've never done anything else. I've been a different type of writer than I may have envisioned at that time. I started out as a sports reporter for a newspaper, went into political writing, which then led into politics, which I never planned to do. And then I got out of that after 5 years because I just didn't like seeing the behind the scenes stuff. And went into public relations writing for a school district for 15 years in Maryland. And in communications writing, I've been a director of communications, media relations director, written 2 books. So all my career has been some type of writing. And I made that decision when I was 12. So
yeah. Well, and I kind of fell into the disaster management weather side of the house where my dad has been with the Florida broadcasters my whole life. So he's been part of the emergency communication for FCC and the state EOC and all that, the Emergency Operations Center. And so I would kind of go out there in high school with him. And so when I went to DC the first time, I didn't plan to go to FEMA. I just had a friend who introduced me to Director Albaugh. And so it became a first job. So I kind of got a taste of it then. And then living in DC on 9/11, I had a very different perspective as even my family here in Texas. And so then when I moved to Florida for the 12 years I lived in Tallahassee, I found myself at emergency management, working on projects and falling in love with it. Not everybody can do crisis management, whether it's from the comm side or the disaster management side. They're like, Hurricane Dorian was obviously my longest activation, but there were other times that, I got woken up at 5 a.m. because we had a community flooding in Florida and had to come into work, or didn't make it to bed that night because we had flooding happening in Pensacola. And, that's not being able to keep a level head and understand how to manage through it and how to talk about it. I always would tell my bosses, no matter what level, like, if you listen to me when it comes to communication, I'll keep you off the front page of that major newspaper. Well, I had one boss who chose not to, and he ended up on the front page of the newspaper. So.
Yeah, before you go into too much detail, I do have this is good timing. I have a specific question about that type of communications. So most people have never been in a crisis command center during a natural disaster. I happen to have experienced that right after moving from Texas to Baltimore in 2003. Never expected to have to deal with hurricanes in Maryland after leaving from Texas, but I was the director of communication for the housing department, so we had to deal with that. So can you tell listeners what it's like forecasting and dealing with hurricanes from a story management perspective?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is that so especially, in Florida, hurricanes, whatever, mainly hurricanes, right? Because you see hurricanes coming, but sometimes tornado outbreaks. But it's having to ensure that you tell the truth and in a way that is not alarming. Now, I will say the National Weather Service has changed some of their messaging, especially when it comes to flooding related to hurricanes and storm surge, right? So more people die in storm surge than they do in the hurricane itself because you can hide from wind, but you have to run from the water. And so unfortunately, it's when it comes to crisis communication in any type of a weather event, it is providing that information correctly and with enough clarity and enough emphasis for people to know you have to act, but you can't scare people. So when I was in Florida, we actually had a kids program that was built. It's 5 books on different types of weather. And I had one that was, we have Professor Tinkermeister had a character that was played by someone we friends with. And we had a little girl whose dad came up at an event and said, she's terrified of weather. Her name was Gabby. I'll never forget that. And she was terrified of tornadoes. Professor Tinkermeister was there, so he got to reassure her what to do. Her dad wrote me a letter a couple months later, and she was just a different child because of that, right? So it was using the storytelling ahead of time to reassure people, but then when something is going on, it's the urgency and making sure people, we keep saying, turn around, don't drown. That's kind of become a common phrase, but it's, I had, I remember one time I was in the middle of a hurricane and got a phone call from Fox Radio, and they wanted to do an interview, and I was like, okay, well, when? And they're like, now. And so I'm like live, and somebody's like, I can't believe you could do that. And I'm like, well, I mean, I know what I'm talking about. I know what the facts are, so yeah, it's really making sure you're telling the right story with the right emphasis, but not scaring people, because if they don't get hit, then the next time they won't do what you're telling them to do.
So what will emergency command centers be like after the DOGE cuts?
I'm really concerned about FEMA. The desire is to push the funding down to locals and states. The problem is that most localities don't have the staff, and they're not going to have the staff. It doesn't make sense for states even to hire 50 people with not the hope, right? But the planning that maybe there might be a tornado outbreak. There was some guidance that came out yesterday to the White House to basically dismantle FEMA and to start firing people. That sounds all well and good. Again, happy to cut government, and there's programs that you could streamline, and there's ways to do that. But coming in and just taking a sledgehammer and getting rid of the federal level, which is then at the regional levels across the country, is going to have catastrophic damage, and it's going to cause loss of life and property or delays in responding to these events that are happening. I am concerned that if you were to have the number of hurricanes that have come at Florida this coming year, like, who's going to be there? I mean, there's a misperception out there. And honestly, the Hurricane Helene misinformation, flat out lies that came out of the president's mouth is why I finally came out and actually formally endorsed Harris. North Carolina was responding to Helene as fast as possible. You had people in the mountains that had no communication, that no one realized had been hit like they had been hit. And not excuses for it. I just was following it all very closely. I was on phone calls with North Carolina's private sector operations center talking about what was going on. And my concern is that when you remove the federal operating component, the coordination is not there. You can't just throw money at localities and states and think that they're going to be able to respond to these. I think this weekend is going to be a test, right? With the catastrophic flooding happening in Kentucky, Tennessee, and now the tornado outbreaks that are happening. I think that we're going to find out real quick what role FEMA plays in these disasters.
What kind of impact will we see in Oklahoma and North Texas, for instance, if these emergency weather centers are dismantled?
So Oklahoma is a little bit different. They're a much smaller one, right? So here in Texas, we've got a large Texas emergency management division, which has the capability, because Texas is so big, right? So if North Texas got hit, they could send people up from South Texas, from TDM, to help out. So Texas is kind of one of those rare states that there's enough kind of staff spread around that you won't necessarily feel that impact right away. A smaller state like Arkansas, which is currently under major flooding and tornadoes, in Oklahoma, you're going to see impacts because they don't necessarily have the staff on standby to be able to go out. Now, you can bring in staff from other states, but that's a process. And that means they have to get reimbursed, right? So New Mexico can come help, but they're going to want to get paid because New Mexico's state budget doesn't have that money, right? No state's got the funding to do it. And somebody said, well, they can send the money down. The problem is, like, Texas and Florida right now are both in legislative sessions dealing with their budgets. Well, if they're not planning on having to do this, they're not identifying that money. So what's going to happen? There's not going to be the money there. And so I do think you're going to see some hiccups, some pain, probably, I would say, from especially smaller states like Oklahoma that may see delays in getting assistance and what they need. I'm also concerned by the cuts that are happening to NOAA inside in the places that you just mentioned, right? So if you we had 40 meteorologists in charge who took the buyout. That's 40 out of 127 weather forecast offices. That's the most senior person. That's a significant loss of experience that's happening. There was at one point a couple of the buildings in Oklahoma that were on the list to be cut by DOJ that they didn't even know what they did. And the only reason they got taken off the list is because the congressman woke up and realized what was going on, and they would have taken the entire radar system down for the country. So that's where the DOJ cuts are going to be hurtful, in that they're not being done to identify what the actual locations do. They're just saying, oh, we'll just cut that lease and save money. So it's all going to be very short-sighted. I think you're going to see, impacts across. I want to make very clear, the National Weather Service team is going to continue to work, even if it's only one or two of them, because they understand life safety, and they're not going to want somebody to get hurt, much like air traffic controllers. They deal with stressful jobs, so they're going to be there, but it's going to be under a lot more stress for them.
What is your greatest fear 3 months into Trump 2.0?
Well, we're almost there, and everything's being recognized, unfortunately. My concern is that, as I alluded to earlier, elected officials who don't want to take on Trump right now because they're worried about being a primary, I'm really concerned that in 6 months, where are we going to be? I'm concerned the tariffs. People are not talking about what the real impacts are going to be to the tariffs. I was just at a supply chain meeting that was North America, so Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and the Canadians, they've got their feelings hurt. They don't understand where this is coming from. We are picking a fight with one of our major allies. I am very concerned about the retribution. I mean, I have friends who have spoken out and have found themselves with death threats and lawsuits. And, 3 months in, 4 months in, I'm just concerned that everything that we knew was going to happen is coming true. And we could have, I feel like I had a magic 8 ball, right? And we knew it. And now it's like, what do we do? I think it's very important for all of us. I've said this on people's first calls and at the meeting that night. Like, I feel like all of us with a voice, even if your voice is only your social media channels, we have to start talking about what is going on and really bring it to people's attention, so we can educate ourselves and really understand what is happening out there.
What's the way back to sanity from where we are now?
I don't think that sanity is going to happen until 26. I mean, I think that that's not true. There are a lot of local elections that can happen. There are a lot of people using voices. People are out using their voice today, in rallies and talking about things. And people are starting to wake up and see the impacts. I think the sanity is using your voice, listening, educating. Don't yell at people. I've been very careful to, if I'm going to tell somebody why I think that federal government shouldn't be cut the way it's cut, I'm trying to present facts, because if you just do it with emotion, then you've lost the battle. But I think that the sanity is going to be over the next couple cycles of elections. I think 26 will be a big changer. I do. I think if the economy is going the way it is now, and people have been laid off and prices are not down, then I think you're going to see moderates and Democrats take back the House, maybe not the Senate, but we'll see. I do see some Republican senators are honestly starting to stand up and fight for things, right? They're voicing their concerns about tariffs, which they haven't been willing to do. And so I do think that maybe they're starting to, and, I think they're starting to really understand what the DOGE cuts look like. They were being told they were being done with agency heads, and they're not being done with agency heads. These are people sitting in a dark room that were doing it. So I don't know. I think let's talk in 6 months and see if we're any more on a road to sanity than we are today.
Okay, we'll come back here at that point and an update. So before we go, can you tell us about your business and what you're doing now that you've left the government?
Sure. So I moved back to Texas after 20 years, 4 years ago. Gosh, this week, actually. So happy to be back in Texas. Started a consulting business. So I do the work in crisis communication, business continuity. I've done some active shooter program development for a big retailer, helping them build out that program. And then I also, because that wasn't enough on my plate, 6 months after starting a company, I also started the Private Sector Emergency Management Association, which brings together business and industry with our NGO and government partners before disasters happen to talk about how do we build more business resilience? How do we build more resilient communities? And then when something happens, how do we as the private sector come together and try to solve problems? So we want to focus on that business, helping business get back to business, right? We've predominantly activated because of hurricanes. And in January, we activated to support the wildfires. We had a lot of interest. And so I focus on my consulting business, but my passion really is that the work that we do through the association, because it gives us a chance to come in and try to help solve the problems and let government focus on the bigger catastrophic events. So I'm excited to be back in Texas. It's been a change. I was up in DC twice, and I lived in the Netherlands in between during the Bush administration. And so it was a lot different moving back to Texas, but it's been great being close to family.
All right. So our guest today has been Communications Executive Julie Roberts. Julie, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about our guest today and the things that we discussed. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.